He built her a fire every night for 30 days before saying her name. The latch froze most nights that fall, so when something hit the door I took it for the wind first. The wind came down off the pass after dark and shouldered the whole cabin like it wanted in, and a man gets so he stops hearing it. Then it hit again, lower, and the wind doesn't knock low. I had the bar up and the rifle in my hand before I'd thought to be afraid, which tells you more about how I'd been living than anything else I could say. She went down across the threshold when I pulled the door. Just folded, the way a horse folds when its legs are done arguing with it. Snow had got into the weave of her shawl and turned to a gray crust, and the ends of her hair were stiff with it, and one of her boots was gone. I remember the boot most. The bare foot blew clear up past the toes, the sock worn through to nothing at the heel. A person doesn't lose a boot and keep walking unless they've been at it a long while and quit feeling their feet a long while back. I got my arms under her and she weighed about what a sack of feed weighs less, and I carried her in and kicked the door shut on the cold and stood there a minute holding her in the middle of my own floor, not knowing where to set her down. That's the first thing, before any of the rest of it. A man my age, alone too long to remember the shape of it, standing in the dark with a half-dead stranger in his arms and the fire near out. So I built the fire, that was the first one. I want to get the count right because the count is the only thing I kept of it in order, all of it. 30 fires before I said her name. I didn't decide that the way you decide to plow a field. It just came to be the rule of the thing, and I'll get to why. That first fire I built one-handed, with her laid on the rope bed and a blanket over her and her still as death, because I was afraid to put her down longer than it took to feed the coals. I'd let it die low. I did that those years, let it burn down to almost nothing and sit in the cold like the cold was something I had coming. Now I dug under the ash for what red was left and laid the dry pine on it and blew until the spots swam, and it caught, and the light came up yellow in the room and put her face into it. She was younger than me by a good ways, but not young, lines at the eyes, a jaw set hard even in a faint. Whoever she was not soft, and I knew that before I knew one other thing about her, knew it from the set of that jaw with no one awake behind it to set it. Some faces go slack, hers held. I'll tell you about the place so you'll see it. It sat where the freight road came up over the pass and started its long slide down the other side toward the river towns. Years back there'd been talk of a relay there, fresh teams for the stage, and a man built the cabin and the barn and the long linta for the mules, and then the stage went a different way and the man went with it. I came after, bought it for what was owed on it. I won't say I came to it for the company of the road because there wasn't much, but the road brought things, a busted axle, a played-out drifter, a freighter caught by an early snow, and I'd feed them and shoe what needed shoeing and take what coin they had or none, and they'd go on. I think now I needed the road to bring me something to do with my hands so my hands wouldn't go to the bottle or the rope. A man finds the work that holds him up. Mine was other people's broke wagons. I'd had a wife. I'll say it plain so it doesn't sit between us the whole way. I'd had a wife and a girl, and a fever came up the valley one spring and took them both inside of 9 days, and it had me too, had me by the throat so hard I lost my voice down in there and never got all of it back. I came up out of that bed and they were already in the ground because I'd been too far gone to dig and a neighbor did it, and I never could find it in me to thank him right, and he's dead now too. So that's the voice. It comes out of me like a wheel that wants grease. People hear it and figure me for older and harder than I am, and that suited me. I let them figure. What I'm telling you is, by the time she came down on my floor, I had been a long time being nobody to no one, and good at it. The fever in her was the same kind I'd had. I knew the smell of it. There's a smell. I won't try to name it, but I knew it across the room, and my stomach dropped because I had nursed exactly 2 people in my life through that smell and put both of them in the dirt. I got her boots off boot, and the bare one I wrapped, and her wet things off down to what a man can decently leave on. And that's all I'll say about it, except that I did it with my eyes near shut and talking the whole time in that ruined voice, telling her what I was doing and why, so that if any part of her could hear it, she'd know it was a fixing kind of touch and not the other. She didn't hear it. She was way down under. But I told her anyway. I have wondered since if I was telling her or telling the room, the way a man will. That first night I sat up with her. I melted snow and got water down her a spoon at a time, and when she shook I put more wood on, and when she burned I damped it down and put snow in a rag on the back of her neck. The dog, I had a dog then, an old yellow brute named for nothing. I just called him Dog. The dog lay against the foot of the bed and would not be moved, and I let him. because the warmth of him was worth something, and because he'd decided the way a dog decides, and there's no fighting it. Toward morning, she said a word, 2 words. Her eyes never opened, but her mouth worked, and she said, plain enough that I caught it over the fire and the wind, she said, "Don't send," and stopped, and her face twisted up like the rest of it cost too much, and then quieter, just breath shaped into it, she said her name. I won't put it down yet. I held on to it like you'd hold a coal in your bare hand, and I didn't say it back, and that was the start of the rule, though I didn't know it was a rule. Because here is the thing about a name. A name is a door. You say a person's name and you've gone in. And she had come to my door with 1 boot, half dead, saying, "Don't send me," and I figured a woman who arrives like that has had too many men go through her door without knocking. So I kept the name where she dropped it, and I shut my mouth over it. Second night the fever broke and came back. They do that. They go down and you think you've won, and then they climb again worse, and that second night was the worst of it. She thrashed and I held her arms, not hard, just enough so she'd not pitch onto the floor, and she fought me with what she had, which by then was not much, and she called a man's name, not mine. I had no name to her. A man's name said like a curse and like a fear all in one, and I have wondered since who that was, and I never asked. I built the fire up high that night, higher than was wise with the chimney the way it was, and I sat in the throe of it and held a woman who didn't know me down on a bed so she wouldn't die, and I'll tell you I felt more like a man than I had in years. That's a hard thing to admit. There's no pride supposed to be in it. But there was. My hands knew what to do. After all that time of my hands only knowing how to mend a wheel, they knew how to keep a person on the right side of the dirt, and they remembered it like they'd never quit. There's a thing I did that second night I've never told, and I'll tell it once. When she was at her worst, burning and gone, I got down on the floor by the bed and I prayed, which I had not done since the spring of the fever, since I quit on it standing over 2 fresh graves I hadn't even dug. I'm not a praying man. I gave it up like a man gives up a horse that's thrown him one too many times. But I got down on my knees on my own cold floor with a stranger dying on the bed, and I made the old words come, and I didn't pray she'd live so much as I bargained. Said if there was anybody listening, take the rest of my voice, take the rest of my years, I'd not miss them, but don't make me dig a 3rd one. I haven't got a 3rd one in me. I don't know that anybody heard, but the fever broke before dawn. I'm not saying the one made the other. I'm saying I bargained and she lived, and a man keeps his end whether the other party was real or not, so I've never once since begrudged the cold or the creak in my throat or the years going by slow up here. I'd promised them away. They weren't mine to begrudge. 3rd night she slept. Just slept, the fever gone down and staying down, sweat coming through clean instead of sour. I built that fire careful and low and good, banked to hold till morning, and I lay down on the floor by the hearth with my coat for a pillow and dog against my back, and I slept the first whole night I'd slept since before I can rightly say. I woke once in the deep of it, and her breathing had got slow and even across the room, and I lay there listening to another person breathe in my house, and it was the strangest comfort, like a clock you didn't know had stopped till it started again. 4th night her eyes opened and found me, and there was nothing soft in them, nothing grateful. She looked at me the way you'd look at a wolf that hadn't decided about you yet, and I looked back and kept my hands where she could see them, and I said in that voice, "You're safe here. Nobody knows you're here. Door's barred and I'm the only one with the bar." And she watched me a long while, and then her eyes went past me to the door and stayed on the door, and I understood we were going to be a while. I want to say something about the door, because the door is half the story. For the better part of 2 weeks she watched it, not glanced. Watched. Sat propped up in the rope bed with the blanket to her chin and her eyes on that door like she could hear something coming up the pass that I couldn't. When I'd go out to the barn, she'd watch me cross to it through the little window, and when I came back she'd have moved, not far, she hadn't the legs yet, but she'd have got herself nearer the corner where she could see both the door and the window at once. I never said a word about it. I'd have done the same in her place. A man learns where the angles are after enough years of needing them. So I let her have the corner. I moved the bed myself when she was strong enough to be off it a few hours, moved it to the corner she favored and didn't say why, and she watched me do it and didn't say why either, and something passed between us in that, a kind of agreement made without words, which is the only kind I ever trusted. The 5th fire, the 6th, the 7th. I'll not number everyone or we'll be here till spring. But I built one every night, and I built them good, and I came to take a care with it I hadn't before. Used to I'd throw on whatever was to hand. Now I split the pine fine for the catching and saved the oak. I had a little oak, hauled up from the low country, saved the oak for when the cold came down hardest, because oak holds a heat that pine can't, and I wanted her warm in the dark hours. I'd lay the fire before she woke and have it going when she did, so the first thing she met of the day was the light of it and not the cold. That was the whole of my courting, if you want to call it that, though I didn't, not then. I'd no more have called it courting than I'd have called it flying. I just didn't want her cold. The 8th day, the road brought a man, and I learned then what I'd be willing to do. It was a freighter named Pell I'd known some years, hauled salt and tinned goods over the pass twice a season, a decent enough man with a mouth on him that ran loose in the towns. I heard his team coming up the grade and I had time. That's the thing about that pass, it gives you time, you hear them a long way down. I went in quiet and I said, "Man coming, friendly but his mouth's not, into the root cellar till he's gone." There was a trap in the floor under the bed, a cellar I kept potatoes and such in, cold and close and dark, no place for a person. And she looked at it and looked at me, and I saw her weigh whether I was the kind of man who'd put a woman down a hole and leave her there. I'd have weighed it too. I held still and let her weigh it. Then she got down into it herself without my hand, and I laid the boards over and set the bed back and threw a sack of feed across the trap, and I went out to meet Pell with my heart going hard, harder than it had any right to. I fed his team and gave him coffee and let him talk, and he talked, the way that kind does, and somewhere in it he said there was a reward going round the river towns for a runaway woman, a tidy sum, and had I seen aught, men were saying she'd come up toward the pass. And I leaned on the door of my own cabin with my coffee, and I said in my creak of a voice that I'd seen nothing but mules and bad weather since the leaves turned, and that a woman with sense wouldn't come up this pass in the cold. She'd go down toward the warm towns, and he allowed that was likely so, and drank his coffee, and went on down the far side by noon. And the whole time, under the floor not 10 feet from where he sat, she was folded in the cold dark holding still, and I knew she was hearing every word of what I said and didn't say, and I weighed every word like I was buying it with coin, because she was listening and I'd not have her hear me give her up even by a flinch. When he was gone down the grade and out of sight, I moved the feed in the bed and lifted the boards, and she came up stiff with the cold of it and white. And the first thing she did, before she'd warm herself, before anything, she stood close and put 2 fingers against the side of my throat where the voice lives, light just touched it, and she said, "It hurts you to talk, and you talked all that time to keep him easy." That's all. Then she went and stood by the fire. But she'd seen what the talking cost me, and she'd named it, and I went out to chop wood I didn't need so I'd have somewhere to put what that did to me. She started talking around the 9th day, not about herself, about the place. She asked what the mules were called, and I said they weren't called anything, they were mules, and she gave me a look, and a few days later I heard her out in the Linta calling one of them Sergeant for the way it stood, and the name stuck, and that mule answers to Sergeant to this day. She asked could she mend, because my shirts were a disgrace, and I gave her the basket, and she sewed sitting up in the bed with the door in her eye line, and the work seemed to settle her, the way the wheels settled me. Her hands were quick. She'd done a lot of it. There was a callus on the side of her middle finger from the needle and another on her palm from something heavier, an axe maybe, or a churn, the hands of a woman who had not been kept soft anywhere she'd been. I want to be careful here not to make her out as some poor broke thing I took in and propped up, because that is not the size of her, and it would shame her and shame the truth both. She was the strongest person who ever came up that pass, and I have seen freighters who could lift the back end of a loaded wagon. She had walked through a high country in the snow with one boot, fevered with somebody behind her she had reason to fear, and she had picked a light in the dark, my fire showing through the little window, and walked to it, and that took a will I have never owned in my life. I have done hard things by enduring them. She did them by deciding them. There's a difference, and she had the better half of it. The 10th night there was a storm that closed the pass. I knew it was coming by the way the mules stood, and by an ache in the throat that storm always woke. I brought in wood till the linta by the door was stacked to the rafters, and I brought the mules and dog all inside the barn and pegged it tight, and I came in white to the eyebrows and barred the door, and we were shut up together then. No road, no chance of the road bringing anything, just the two of us and the fire and the wind trying the latch all night long like a thing with hands. That was a good night. I shouldn't say it, but it was. The wind was wild and the cabin held in the fire. I built a fire that night I'd put against any fire ever burned, the oak going steady and the room gold with it. And she sat in her corner with a quilt and her mending, and I sat across with a harness I was oiling, and neither of us said much, and the not saving much was easy for the first time. There's a quiet that's two people not knowing what to say, and there's a quiet that's two people who don't need to. And somewhere in that storm we crossed from the one to the other, and I felt it cross. She said out of nothing, watching the fire and not me, "You build a good fire." And in that voice of mine, I said it was about all I was good for, which was a lie, but it's what a man says, and she didn't laugh. She looked at me then, really looked, the way she'd looked at the door all those days, like she was hearing something coming, and she said, "No, it isn't," and went back to her mending, that's all. But I carried that around for a week. "No, it isn't," like she'd seen further into the room than I had. Around the 12th, 13th day, she stopped watching the door so much. I noticed because the day I noticed, she had her back to it. She was at the hearth stirring something and her back was to the door and she hadn't moved the bed to keep it in view, and I sat very still so as not to spook the thing, the way you sit still when a wild bird lights near your hand. She had decided I was the bar on the door. That's what it was. She'd stopped watching the door because she'd put the watching on to me, and I have been handed a great many things in my life, coin and thanks and a few curses, but I was never handed anything I held as careful as that. A person deciding you're the thing that stands between them and what they're running from. There's no weight like it. It straightens a man right up. I'll tell you about the night I learned the size of what she was running from, because you've a right to it and so did I, though I never asked. It was the 17th fire or near it. There were riders on the pass, 3. I heard them before Dog did, which never happened, but I'd got so I slept light as a deer with her in the house. I was up and had the lamp out and the rifle down, and I had her by the shoulder, gentle, before she was full awake, and I said low, "Riders, get back in the corner and be still." And I will never forget, she did not freeze and she did not weep. Her face came awake all at once and went hard as the day I first saw it slack in the firelight, and she got up and she got my old pistol from the shelf where she'd long since found it without my telling her, and she went to the corner and put her back to the logs and held that pistol in 2 steady hands pointed at the door, and she said, just as low as me, "If they come through, I won't go back. I'll go down here first. You understand me?" And I said I did. I went out to meet them with the door barred behind me, and the rifle held down along my leg. They were hard men. You know hard men by the way they sit a horse when they don't want anything good. The one in front had a face like a hatchet and a voice like he was used to it doing his work for him. He said they were looking for a woman. Said she belonged to a man down the river, said the man would pay for word of her, said it any come up the pass this last while. And he looked past me at the cabin, at the smoke of my good oak fire going up into the snowlight, and I felt the whole of my life come down to where I stood in the cold with my voice ruined, and my hands not shaking, which surprised me, my hands not shaking. I told him no woman had come up the pass. I told him in that Wheel Creek voice that no one comes up this pass this time of year that I don't shoe or bury, and I'd done neither lately, and they could ride down and ask at the river towns and welcome. I told him the next storm would close the pass behind him by night if he didn't start down, which was true. I could feel it in my throat, and a man like that, who knows the country, will weigh his own neck before he weighs a stranger's word, and I watched him weigh it. The hatchet-faced one looked at me a long time. I have been looked at like that before by my own black moods in the mirror, and I looked back the way you look back at those, which is to say I didn't blink and I didn't care. And there's nothing a hard man hates worse than a man who doesn't care, because not caring is the one thing he can't put a price on or a fist to. He said something low to the others. He said to me, riding off, that if I was lying it'd come back on me. And I said in that voice that most things do, and I'd take my turn with the rest. And they went down the pass, and the storm came that night and closed it behind them just like my throat said it would. And I never saw them again, though I cleaned that rifle every night for a month after and slept with it by the bed. I came back in and barred the door, and she was still in the corner with the pistol, and her hands had started to shake now that the need for them was past, the way mine never had, and I crossed the room slow with my own hands open, and I took the pistol from her gentle by the barrel and set it down, and she stood there shaking and would not be held. I could see she would not, so I didn't try to hold her. I just stood close enough that she could lean if she wanted to, and after a while she did. Put her forehead against my chest, no more than that, the weight of her head and nothing else, and stood there breathing. And I stood there being a wall for her to put her head on, and I'll tell you that being a wall for someone is not a small thing. It is maybe the largest thing I have done, and I have built barns. I built the fire up after she slept. The 18th fire. I built it up and sat in front of it and looked at my hands a long time. They were old hands, Scarred across the back from 40 years of work and weather, the knuckles big, a finger that hadn't sat straight since a wheel rim caught it in '63. I had thought of them as just the tools I had left. That night I thought of them different. They had stood between a good woman and 3 hard men, and the men had gone down the pass. There's not many days a man gets to know clean down to the bone that he is good for something. I'd had 2 now. The day I kept her alive and the day I kept them out. I sat there in my gold light and I was not nobody. For the first time since the fever I was somebody, and the somebody I was hers to lean on, and that was the whole of it, and it was enough, and more than I'd ever looked to have again. She told me the next morning the size of it. Not all, but the shape. There was a man down the river she'd been given to, the way cattle are given, to settle a thing between 2 families. And he was the kind of man you'd run through snow with 1 boot to get away from. And she had run, and she would not go back, and she'd sooner the cold had her on the pass than go back. And she said all this plain at the table over the bread she'd made, looking at me straight, daring me almost, daring me to flinch or to figure her cheap for it. And I didn't flinch. I said a man who'd treat a woman that way wasn't owed a thing by her, nor by God, nor by me. And that she could stop running the day she chose to, and that this was as good a day as any, and there was room enough. And I said it in my ruined voice across my own table with the door barred behind me, and she heard it. I watched her hear it, and her jaw came unset just a little, just at the corners, the first time I ever saw at ease. She still didn't tell me she'd stay, and I still didn't say her name. We'll get there. After that, the days were different. Lighter, I want to say, though the country went deeper into winter and the dark came earlier every evening. She mended everything I owned and then started in on improving it. She set the cabin to rights in ways I'd let go so long I'd quit seeing them. A shelf hung straight, the chinking redone where the wind whistled, a curtain of all things across the little window, made from a flour sack bleached and hemmed, and the morning I saw that curtain I had to go out to the barn a while and stand with the mules. A curtain. A small white curtain on the window of a place that had been a man's hole to wait out his life in. I stood out there with Sergeant breathing on my neck, and I'll not say I wept because I'm not built to any more. The fever took that along with the voice, but I stood out there a good while. She'd cook and we'd eat across from each other, and she set 2 plates without thinking about it. And one night I noticed she'd set the second plate before I'd come in, set it for me without my being there to remind her there was a me, and that's a thing too. To be expected at a table. To be a chair that gets a plate whether you've earned it that day or not. I hadn't had that in so long I'd forgot it was a thing a person could have. The dog took to her past all sense. He'd lie at her feet now instead of mine and look at me like I ought to understand, and I did understand, and I told him so. We fell into a way of being that I'd forgot was possible. Mornings she'd be up before me some days, and I'd wake to the smell of coffee and the sound of her moving soft so as not to wake me. And I'd lie there a minute with my eyes shut just to have it. The sound of a person in the house with no hurry in them, no fear in them, just moving about a place they'd decided was theirs. Evenings we worked across from each other in the fire. She taught me a thing or two. She could read, better than me. And she'd read out of the one book I had, a worn-through almanac and a Bible with the front pages gone. And her voice reading low was a thing I'd lay down the harness just to listen to. I taught her the country, what the clouds meant coming over the pass, how to read the mules for weather, how to set a snare in the willows down by the creek, and she took to it quick and proud. And the day she brought in a rabbit she'd snared herself and laid it on the table without a word, just looked at me, daring me again, daring me to say a woman couldn't. I didn't say it. I said it was a fine, fat rabbit and we'd eat well, and she near smiled, which on her was a whole sunrise. She was good is what I'm saying, and strong, and she'd no more lean on a man she didn't think worth leaning on than she'd lean on a rotten post. That's what made it mean something, her leaning. She'd weighed me. She weighed everything, and she'd decided I'd hold. I want to be honest about the rule, the name. By now I knew it well. She'd said it that first fevered night, and it had lived in me ever since. And I could have said it any day at the table across the fire, calling her in from the lean-to. But I didn't, and the longer I didn't, the more it came to mean. Because a name's a door, like I said, and I'd decided, without deciding, the way I decide everything, that I would not go through her door until she opened it from her side. I would not say her name and make her mine in the saying of it, the way that hatchet-faced man would have. She'd been claimed by men her whole life, given and taken and run after, named like a thing you put your brand on. I wasn't going to be one more mouth saying her name like it gave me a right to her, so I went around it. I'd say you, or I'd just start talking, and she'd know it was to her because there was no one else, or I'd say nothing and hand her the cup. 30 days I did that, and she noticed. I know she noticed because of how it ended. The cold, deepest part of winter came on. There were nights the oak wasn't enough, and I'd build the fire up and we'd both end near it, her in the chair with the quilt and me on the floor with my back to the warm stones, and we'd talk low or not at all. She told me a little more of herself in those nights, in pieces the way I'm telling you this, out of order and circling. Where she was from, which was back east and then not. A mother she'd loved. A sister she'd lost track of. She never asked me much because she was the kind who'd worked out you don't dig at a man, but one night she asked about the voice. Asked it gentle. And I told her about the fever and the wife and the girl, told it flat the way you tell a thing you've turned to stone so it can't cut you anymore, and she listened with her hands still in her lap. And when I was done, she didn't say she was sorry, which I was grateful for. The sorry people say is a coin worn smooth. She said, what were their names? And I told her, and she said them back, once, soft, into the fire, like she was setting them somewhere safe. And that was the closest I came to going to pieces in front of her. To hear another living person say their names out loud after all those years of them living only in me, said gentle, set safe. I had to look at the fire a long time. So she'd say the names of my dead, but I'd not say hers living. I see how that sits, telling it now. There's a kind of debt in it I didn't mean, but it's how it was. There was a hard stretch in the deep of it where I want you to know we nearly went short. A long cold, 2 weeks of it without a break. And the wood I'd laid by going down faster than I'd reckoned, because I kept the fire up for her and never told her that's why. And the salt pork down to the last of it. And one of the mules took a colic that had me out in the barn most of 2 nights with my arm in past the elbow doing what you do for a colicked mule, which is not a thing I'll describe at this table. I came in those mornings spent through and frozen, and she'd have hot water ready and bread, and she'd not fuss over me, which I'd have hated. She'd just set it down and let me be a man too tired to talk. And that was its own gift, being let alone in the right way. The mule lived. The wood held, barely. I went up the slope in snow to my hips and brought down a dead standing pine I'd been saving for spring and bucked it up in the cold with my breath freezing in my beard. And I hauled it down a sledge load at a time. And she met me at the door every load and took the wood from my arms so I'd not have to set it down and bend for it again. And we stacked it together in the lean-to, the 2 of us, not talking. Just the wood going up between us load by load until we were ahead of the cold again. There's a closeness in keeping warm together through a bad cold that I can't put words to. It's older than talking. You haul wood beside a person through a killing winter, and you know things about them you'd never learn at a church social in 100 years. The 29th fire I'll tell you about because of what was in the air, though nothing happened that you could point to. There was a thaw, a false one. The kind that comes in deep winter and fools the green things into trouble. The icicles ran off the eaves all day, and the pass softened, and I knew the road would open in a few days, knew the world would come back, knew that meant she could go if she wanted to go. Down the far side to the river towns, on away to a sister or a city, or just away from a man whose voice creaks and whose place is a hole on a pass. I'd told her she could stop running. I hadn't ever told her she had to stay, and I never would. Because a woman who's been kept is owed by every man after a chance to walk free, and I'd sooner have died than be the door she couldn't get out of. So that 29th night I said it. Hardest thing I said the whole of it, harder than facing the riders. I said in my voice, pass'll open in a few days, road'll run again, you've coin enough, I'll stake you the rest. There's the stage down at the river, takes you anywhere you've a mind to go. I said it looking at the fire, not at her, because I couldn't have said it to her face. I said, you don't owe me a day past the one you want to stay. You never did, not the first one. And the room got so quiet, I could hear the thaw running off the roof. She didn't say anything for a long while, long enough I thought I'd done it, set her free, the way you let a hawk off your wrist and feel the empty after. Then she got up out of her chair. I heard her cross the floor. I kept my eyes on the fire because I was a coward about it all of a sudden after the riders and everything. And she knelt down beside me on the hearthstones in the gold of the fire I'd built, and she took my hand, that old scarred hand with the finger that won't sit straight. She took it in both of hers and turned it over and looked at it like it was a thing worth looking at, and she said, you've built me a fire every night since I came, 30 nights. She'd counted too. All that time I thought I was the only one counting. 30 nights, she said, and you never once said my name, not once. Why? And I told her the truth, because she had my hand in hers and there was nowhere left to go around it. I said a name's a door, and I wasn't going to walk through hers until she opened it, because too many men had walked through it without knocking, and I'd not be one more. I said it badly, in pieces, the voice giving out in the middle of it, but I got it said. She was quiet again. Then she did a thing I'll see till they put me down. She lifted my hand and put it flat against her cheek, my whole rough palm against the side of her face, and she held it there, and she leaned into it, and she looked at me, not at the door, not past me, at me, and she said, "Then I'm opening it." And she said her name. Her own name out of her own mouth, given, not taken. She said, "Say it." And so I did. The 30th night by the fire I'd built with her cheek warm in my hand, I said her name out loud for the first time in that ruined, creaking voice, and it came out of me like a thing I'd been carrying up a long hill, and I'll not write it here for you because it isn't yours and it isn't mine to spend. It's hers. She gave it to me by that fire, and I've spent it careful every day since, and I'll not waste it on a page. But I said it. And she shut her eyes when I did, and a breath went out of her like the last of the running going out, all of it. The snow and the one boot and the hatchet-faced men and the man down the river, all of it leaving on that one breath, and she opened her eyes and they were wet and steady both, and she said my name back. She'd known it all along, she'd found it the way she found the pistol without being told, and she'd held it the same as I'd held hers, waiting. She said it plain and certain, and a man's name in the mouth of a good woman who has decided on him is the finest sound there is, finer than running water, and I have heard a lot of running water. We stayed there on the hearthstones a long time, her cheek in my hand and the fire going down slow and good. I didn't reach for more than that, and she knew I wouldn't, and that was part of it. There'd be time. The pass would open and the world would come back, and there'd be a preacher down at the river by and all the rest of it in its season. But that night was just the two names said, and the fire and her leaned into my hand, and it was the whole world, and it was enough. The pass opened that week, the world came back. The road brought its busted wagons and its played-out drifters, and I shod them and fed them same as ever. Except now there was a curtain on the window and a second plate at the table that was set on purpose, and a woman with a hard jaw that had learned to ease, who'd stand at my shoulder in the doorway watching the freighters come up the pass, her hand light on my arm, the both of us steady there in the door of the place that used to be a man's hole to die in slow. She never went back down the river. The man there is dead now, I heard, some years on, killed over cards, which is the only fitting end I can think of for him, and I felt nothing about it but glad she never had to. She runs the place as much as I do more. She named the rest of the mules. She buried Dog with me when his time came and held my arm at the grave, and said the dog's name soft into the dirt the way she'd said my dead one's, setting it safe. People come up the pass and they take me for what I always was, an old man with a creak in his voice and big scarred hands, and they take her for my wife, which she is, and they don't see anything past it, and that's all right. They don't know about the 30 fires. They don't need to, but I'll tell you since you've sat for it. Most nights still, when the cold comes down off the pass and the wind tries the latch like a thing with hands, I build the fire. I take a care with it. I split the pine fine and I save the oak for the hardest cold. And I get it going before she's settled so the light's up gold in the room when she sits down across from me. She watches me do it sometimes over her mending, and she'll catch my eye, and she doesn't say, "You build a good fire" anymore because we're long past needing it said. She just looks at me across the gold light, the way she looked at me the first time she ever looked at me instead of the door, like she's heard something coming and the something is good. And I say her name. Every night now I say it. I'd hoarded it 30 days, and I've spent it free ever since, and it never once ran out.